Hi there, Gideon Rose, Editor of Foreign Affairs, and welcome to another edition of Foreign Affairs Focus. We have the great pleasure of being here today with Christopher Sabatini, Editor-in-Chief of the Americas Quarterly and Senior Policy Director at the Americas Society, and the author of a brilliant new article, Rethinking Latin America, in the current issue of Foreign Affairs. So, Christopher, why do we need to rethink Latin America? What is wrong with the way American academic and policy elites currently think about the region?
Latin America, two reasons. First of all, Latin America has always been framed as largely sort of a comparative development issue. In academia, typically when people talk about it, and you look at the list of most courses in Latin America, and even most recent publications, deals with issues of comparative politics or development, issues of elections, party formation, ethnic groups and the like. Very rarely is a question of international relations. And in our foreign policy too, that's manifested itself. That still we talk about issues in terms of comparative politics, development. And the problem right now, especially in a region that's become much more assertive in terms of its foreign policy and much more diverse, is that issues of interstate relations are becoming much more to the fore. And consequently, questions like Brazil, which is rising both as a result of its own economic growth, but also in terms of its own diplomacy, is now challenging some of the U.S. interests in ways that we really haven't seen before. But at the same time, in academia and the foreign policy community, they continue to talk about this as if it were really a question of our backyard or a question of comparative politics and development, rather than real state competition.
So you're saying we shouldn't care about economic progress or democracy or human rights?
No, I think we should continue to care about that. But I don't think it should be the prism through which we view the region. And that prism has had a number of really deleterious effects on our policy. First of all, there's still a tendency to focus on the smaller countries that really take our eye off the ball of rising countries like Brazil and challenges like Venezuela. For example, in the case of recently, the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs was held up because of questions of our policy Cuba. Let me put that in context. Cuba is a country of 11 million people in which we held up our ambassador for the entire region just over questions of policy of that. It's held up by Senator Rubio. Similarly, in 2009, our appointment to the ambassadorship to Brazil and for the hemisphere was held up over Honduras, our policy towards Honduras, a country of 7 million people. What this means is in taking human rights so seriously, and the prism through which we see the region, we've really elevated in a way that's become a bottleneck for a discussion, framing of policy issues around countries that where really our national interests are more at play.
So does this boil down to us spending too much time and energy and attention on Central America and the Andes and not enough on the southern parts of the region?
That's part of it. Certainly, again, and a lot of this is also based on the vestiges of the Cold War. A lot of the think tanks, a lot of the NGOs and human rights groups that really shape and debate public policy in Washington and elsewhere really grew out of the Cold War, and they bring with that a lot of that baggage, a lot of their concerns over those issues, and a lot of the polarization that came with the 1980s. And consequently, we're also missing the ball in competition among states. There are points of friction between states in Latin America. Brazil, again, is being resurgent, is trying to really hive off more of a region in which it can assert its own influence within South America and keep the U.S. a little bit distant. There are tensions between Bolivia and Chile. And of course, increasingly on trade, which we've tried to engage the hemisphere, engaging bilaterally, country by country, we've really missed the boat on the larger trade issue of how to shape a trade agenda with China or Asia and Latin America vis-a-vis China, which is beginning to take shape, but really hadn't until recently.
President Dilma's in town, and President Obama is going to Cartagena for a summit next week. How is the Obama administration doing, and what would they say about your piece?
Well, I would like to think they agree with parts of it. I think they would agree. I very much think they agree with sort of the question of holding up the nominations and why that shouldn't have happened. In the case of Dilma, they would often say that there is much more than meets the eye in their relationship with Brazil, that there's much more a diverse and multifaceted relationship than existed. But I think many of them and others of sort of the popular punditry on Latin America would say that our relationship with Brazil has not quite evolved to status that we quite are able to deal with Brazil in the way it wants to be dealt with.
I noticed the Brazilians seem to have complained that they're not getting the full retinue of a major state visit the way some other heads of state have gotten.
They didn't get a state dinner. And you notice the body language between Dilma and Obama was very chilly. And part of that's because, unlike the other BRIC nations, we really do have a tendency to sort of talk down to or chide Brazil in ways that we wouldn't do to, say, the other BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, or China, especially on the policy on Iran or Syria or Libya. We really sort of upbraid them, and that I think it really chafes their own sense of their arrival and their desire to remake and democratize a lot of the institutions of world governance, including the World Bank, IMF, and the UN Security Council. And they just simply, we really haven't developed that level of partnership. And again, part of that is because we've tended in the hemisphere to talk about shared values and principles and history and democracy in ways that discuss the development agenda, but not the interstate relations agenda. Now, fast forward to Obama's trip this weekend to Cartagena for the Summit of the Americas. And this, again, is somewhat of an anachronism. It's a collection of 34 elected heads of state in the hemisphere, created in 1994. If you look back on when it was created and today, you see how much has really has changed. First of all, at the time, the idea was to create a bloc of countries that shared democratic principles and countries that would eventually one day form a bloc of a free trade area of the Americas. Neither of those things have come true. Democracies have produced elected governments that are much more divergent from the U.S. interests. They may share some basic values, but they have different approaches to market economies. They have different approaches to human rights. They have different approaches to global politics. But they also conflict with the United States in other fundamental ways: U.S. drug policy, immigration policy, trade policy. That means that we've formed the summit process of 34 elected heads of state that really don't have much in common anymore, other than sharing a hemisphere. And what tends to happen in these events, as it happened 3 years ago at Trinidad and Tobago when it was the last time they met, it really plays to the lowest common denominator. A lot of platitudes, a lot of grip and grins and photo ops, but very little that actually affects the interstate relations among these countries. Case in point, this summit in Cartagena, the agenda and the topic is connecting the Americas and how to create better connections. Again, not something you'd see on the agenda of most summits, and something that you really probably shouldn't see on a summit between a group of countries in the Americas.
So we should ditch the large-scale summitry and go the full Brazilian?
I think that would be the way to go. Go the full Brazilian. Develop much more tighter bilateral relations and relations between blocs, as we did a week ago with Felipe Calderón and Stephen Harper for a NAFTA conference. Again, there they dealt with real things. They dealt with trade, they dealt with accession to Asian markets, and they dealt with drugs. So full Brazilian or the full Mexican.
Christopher Sabatini, Rethinking Latin America. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.